In this video, we'll discuss the relation between speech and the ego. Lecture 5 are bookends to a presentation by the Hegelian philosopher Jacques Lacan found in the appendix of Seminar 1. In that talk, he provides a philosophical analysis of Freud's 1925 essay Verneinung, found in volume 19 of the Standard Edition, and translated there as negation. Lacan begins by summarizing points from the previous lecture. He returns to the seesaw motion of speech as a site where resistance manifests. This movement appears to be a back and forth between full speech and empty speech, with empty speech being supported by the ego and addressed to the other, the analyst, who is made present through transference. Lacan ends the introduction noting that the ego is an alienated form of being. In section 1, we find addressed the notion of l'entrecroissement linguistique, the linguistic crisscrossing. This concerns speech, which operates at a different register than the ego. According to Lacan, language and symbols function within the web of an interweaving system whereby individual symbols relate not only to the totality of that linguistic system, but also connect to particular symbols, including opposing ones. And this produces an overflowing and overdetermination of those symbols. In Freud's terminology, we might think of this in terms of displacement and condensation. In displacement, ideas are redirected to another idea. Here, a threatening or unacceptable idea is attributed to something else through the mechanism of projection. You're angry at your boss, so you kick the dog. In condensation, several unconscious ideas are brought together, concentrated and represented by a single idea. The dream of a snake, for example, does not correspond to any single interpretation, but represents a conglomeration of conflictual ideas. We see this exemplified in the story of Freud's forgetting of the name Signorelli discussed in the previous video. The difference here with Lacan is that rather than unconscious ideas, he's addressing speech and language. For Lacan, language has a life of its own, independent of any conscious ego. Language lives, and it lives like a foreign body, an interiorized exteriority that's closer to the truth of the subject than is the one, the ego, who may encounter such foreignness. What is alien to the ego is what the ego has been alienated from. This is because the ego is fundamentally a méconnaissance, a misunderstanding. It is, as stated in the intro, an alienated form of being that functions as a refusal, a Verforfen, to recognize speech in its revelatory character, thinking itself instead the master of the words emanating from its body. But, and this is key, speech always says more than what's intended. This is part of its overflowing, overdetermined quality. Rather than consider language a skill that one possesses, it may be more accurate to think of language as inhabiting us, an inhabiting that is a precondition for speaking. It's here, in this linguistic excess, that analysis does its work. Following a brief introduction of the term Verneinung, which was translated as negation in the Standard Edition, but is perhaps better translated as denegation or denial, Lacan turns the floor over to the philosopher Hippolyte to examine Freud's text. What follows is a discussion on the difference between Verneinung and Bejahung, affirmation. Considered within a psychoanalytic context, we must keep in mind Freud's statement that there is no negation in the unconscious. It is the ego that is the failure to recognize the affirmation of the unconscious. At the extreme, there can be a wholesale rejection, a Verwerfung of the symbolic. In this case, the symbolic is not realized in one's history, but in the external world as a hallucination. The external world becomes immediate, that is, unmediated by the symbolic. And so manifestations appear in a kind of primitive, non-symbolized real. As Lacan puts it, what is not recognized erupts into consciousness in the form of the seen. So we have a seeming paradox here. Bejahung is the affirmation that something exists for a subject. It's the primordial inclusion of the signifier. When this is missing, when the signifier is rejected, it enters the real and thereby becoming immediate. This is confusing if we don't have a grasp of what Lacan means by existence. It's closer to what Freud means when he's discussing the concept of the judgment of existence in that essay. The judgment that something exists, its affirmation, is a precondition for something to have any other qualities attributed to it. Language institutes the possibility of such affirmation. And yet, at the same time, we must keep in mind that which does not exist in this sense is not nothing. Just as the empty center of a wheel allows it to turn, or the emptiness of a jug allows it to be filled. We'll return to discuss this with much greater depth in due time. And so, the discussion of ego in speech reveals two modes of relation, recognition and seeing. Recognition involves a kind of remembering or recollection, the tracing of the signifier in one's life through history. It is, in other words, the realization of the subject's reconstructed past in relation to a future. Seeing, or the seen, entails a kind of reminiscence, which Lacan, interestingly, explicitly connects to the Platonic theory of forms. Reminiscence involves a reliving of the past as if it's present, a reliving the events of the past in a sort of experiential manner. Psychoanalysis, Lacan claims, aims at recognition and thus remembering and recollection, and not reminiscence. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to share this video, leave a comment, question, or constructive critique, and I'll see you next time.